I thank all of these and the funding agencies that have helped supported this work. So let's start from the very beginning, just to give you an idea of myself. That's me at, I don't remember, a tender age of 1 or 2, big kid. Always had a lot of stuff ahead of them and thinking about the world and all that kind of stuff. And then it went radically wrong to the point where my parents had to send me to a military camp. You can see the military academy, which I spent the summer and learned how to make my bed and bounce a quarter off of it. And for those who know how to make beds and make them really tight, that was a metric. But what got me involved in science and engineering was my love affair with science fiction. I watched a lot of Star Trek, and so I thought I was Vulcan. As you can tell, I have a pointy ear, a manifestation that I grew up with. So I really thought that maybe I came from a different planet and had that logical thinking. Of course, another movie came out and that screwed everything up. And so I could no longer make that kind of argument. Just to give you an idea, again, Star Trek was my road towards engineering. Thought I would go into aerospace, but I thought it was a little bit too focused, and I didn't like its flexibility, even though we were doing a lot of the space race and launching these vessels up into space during the time that I was an undergraduate. And so I started doing some more stuff in advanced automation and robotics, and worked on some of these. These are more later robotics. The ones that I had to work on looked nothing like this. And then I had an opportunity to work at GE. It was really at GE, even though these were images. If you've never been to a site where they throw these frozen birds at a functioning engine to understand bird strikes and the ability for these planes to still survive after a bird strike, it is absolutely fascinating. So I was able to work on some things like that. But I was more interested because in environmental, because GE was interested in reducing their compliance costs. Of course, I was more interested in really protecting the environment, public health protection. And so I switched gears and went to University of Illinois. By the way, this is me. Notice no gray hair at the time. But also, I found this picture because I didn't remember taking this picture. It is on UIUC's website as a historical image. I wasn't that old. I mean, it's just weird. But anyway, it was the start of my environmental research, and I worked with then Mark Clark at UIUC. This slide, just to show you all the different research that I've been very fortunate to work on. The vast majority is related to water and wastewater, but there were some places where I was able to work on some things like with colleagues in College of Natural Resources on plant systems biology, doing some stuff with other microbiologists to look at like regulatory modeling. And then more recently, I've been working with some folks and looking at airborne pathogens because of COVID and SARS-CoV-2 and the challenge now that we have with that. So really, if I were to characterize my journey, it's about this idea that diversity produces transformative and impactful solutions. So I've learned by working with colleagues in all these number of areas that I'm not necessarily experts in, but I was just curious and I always wanted to contribute to the problem at hand. And that from utilizing some of the data, much of it, the connection that I have was because I was interested in developing and validating the models that would be helpful to solving the problems that they were trying to do. So that included some of the things like UV. I did a lot of years doing UV work and trying to fit UV reactors in all kinds of places, and studied the influence of pipe configurations and how it would affect performance. And so we had done some work to look at those. This is just a replication of some of the UV reactors. And then using pretty pictures like this that I think belong in the Guggenheim Museum, but the colors represent different kinds of images, red representing high concentration of microorganisms, blue, low concentrations, and that the UV light would transform based on kinetics that we would measure in the laboratory setting to represent how different designs, configurations, upstream piping configuration will influence the result of the performance of that UV reactor. Did that, had many years working with fats, oils, and grease in sewer collection systems, and took this into a two-phase modeling of oil separation from grease interceptors and helping the industry trying to design better grease interceptors from food service establishments. And then this was the one that was really fun and exciting. This was the lignin biosynthesis pathway that folks in the College of Natural Resources were interested in trying to manipulate and manage so that they can either make better or more efficient paper or biofuels out of some of these tree structures. And the thing about it is we would develop these kinds of mathematical representation of empirical constants that needed to be validated and calibrated, which we did with about $5 million worth of experimental data to do so that we can predict, depending on the mass flow through this pathway, looking at what the wild type conditions would do from the influent, or so let's say earlier precursors, to all the way to the main precursors that would feed into the lignin structure at the end. And then, of course, once you have a model, looking at knockdown of enzyme families that would shift some of these, that would create different lignin structures. And so I didn't know how well these models would work, and I worked with a team to develop this, but we were able to predict about 75% of the different structures that were created from these different knockdowns that were done, which I considered, if I were a betting person, I was shooting for at least 50%, just to say that's not a bad start, but to be north of that, considerably north of that, was exciting. So, just to give you an idea, the thing that I have learned from all of this is that for students, it just builds success, exposing them to an interdisciplinary culture, as you know, their ability to have these kinds of conversations, communicating to a diverse audience, and stronger leadership skills. So many of the graduate students who worked on these projects were able to explain, have won 3-minute thesis competitions and other things because of their communication skills in such a diverse environment. All right, so you didn't come to hear all of that. You came to listen about this idea of these elevated temperature landfills and the challenges. So you can imagine what we've got for a landfill. It is basically a glorified biological reactor that needs to be managed and controlled so that it doesn't spill any of the contents anywhere else, that it maintains its structure. It is highly heterogeneous, having both biological and chemical reactions that are happening in these things. The idea, based on just the reactions themselves, which are mostly biological, that you really shouldn't exceed anywhere from around 45 to 60 degrees C. Any higher temperature than that, then of course the biological activity would shut down and stop doing the degradation that it was intended to. Really high temperatures would then start to affect the infrastructure and the lining and other things that are in place to protect that landfill from not going to any nearby water table, and the types of leachate that would be created from such a thing. And so what happens in elevated temperature landfills? Well, the temperatures are elevated, very high temperatures where you see kinds of things like steam from gas wells, temperatures that can exceed 100 degrees C, sublimation and some kind of sinkholes that just pop out of nowhere. And then, of course, other kinds of things where you see different constituencies of the gas that is coming from those glass wells. Places where people have measured this, again, you would do some kind of measurement with time. You would expect things to be around 50 degrees C, but then all hell breaks loose when you start seeing things exceed that significantly and reach temperatures that basically shut down the ability of that landfill to do its job. And so people would measure things like, of course, methane production, because what they would see in elevated temperature, the methane production would decrease with increasing carbon dioxide and other kinds of gases that are being produced. And so they would measure those kinds of things looking at higher temperatures, and then, of course, a subsequent reduction in methane and CO2 increases as part of that. So what are those characteristics? Just to summarize, you're talking about things that exceed well above 80 to 100, maybe even higher than that. They have over a large area where you would see, again, low methane production, higher production of carbon monoxide and hydrogen. The strength of the leachate has changed, or constituencies of that leachate would change. And then you run into the problems with the liners that are could be impacted structurally, not to mention the odorous gases that may happen. So the question that was posed to me by Mort Barlaz at the time was, where does the heat come from? What is generating those heat sources that go beyond to these high temperatures? What kind of reactions? Because there may be lots of sources that heat can be produced. Are they significant enough that, or important enough to track? And so those would be there. And then how do we quantify the heat transfer, and what are the factors that are involved in those heat transfer? And these were some of the questions that were asked, at least from a modeling standpoint. That was something that we do. So why models? Because I've been doing a career developing these models. They're useful. They do provide looking at a more fundamental understanding, particularly when experiments are difficult to do in those conditions that you're trying to explore. Of course, everybody has heard of this phrase by Box, a statistician: all models are wrong, but some are useful. Very common. Well, but when models are useful, oh, what innovations we can make. And I just said that. So you can quote me as of today. Okay, so how does the models break down? Well, we looked at a number of different reactions that would cause heat generation. So we're looking acid-base, anaerobic, aerobic. And then we looked at, because there is a significant number of landfills that accept ash, either MSW ash or from coal fire. And so then you would say, well, do these ash undergo some kind of processes, either in the form of hydrating it or carbonation, ash hydration and carbonation? The other things is that landfills may contain things like metals that may undergo corrosion. All those processes, including evaporation. We did explore the idea that if the temperatures were high enough, would we get into this zone of exothermic pyrolysis? But that reaches a very high threshold to do that. We ended up not really modeling this, although some people had proposed that that may have been happening. And then, of course, from the cooling side of things, trying to include things like conduction, convection. There is the process of condensation. We didn't capture that in our first model, but you'll see that we tried to incorporate that in our spatial model using CFD. And then boundary conditions, and then, of course, infiltration is part of that. So the two models that we developed with time were one that was based really on a batch reactor, very simplified, looking at more or less what are the contributions to the heat formation so that we can narrow down. We don't want to model everything under the sun, but no pun intended. But the idea was just to try to figure out what those sources were, and then incorporate the more common things into a spatial resolve model, because then we can actually propose to landfill owners what are best strategies for burial, and do we spread the ash over a larger area, or do we sort of put it as a block in strategic locations to try to limit some of those temperatures? So starting with our batch reactor model, looking at things in terms of our infiltration was more or less the water that would infiltrate from top to bottom, like rain events and things. Gas composition, we looked at hydrogen, methane, CO2 formation. We also looked at possible onset of aerobic heat processes, because some people measured nitrogen in their gas wells, suggesting that there may have been some air intrusion, assuming that that nitrogen was part of the air that was coming in atmospheric through those. And so we included some limited processes that were aerobic heat contributions. Again, looking at some of the different processes that we did. With a batch reactor model, it's very simplified. You can't do a lot of things with it, but again, it does provide that first level of investigation of the types of reactions that are happening in this process. So we look, as I mentioned, we did look at the idea of if there was oxygen or aerobic biodegradation. that would intrude, but it would be a form of how much nitrogen that might have been measured in the gas well and do some kind of percent balance to incorporate some of that aerobic contribution to heat formation. We didn't see a lot of that because, again, from the amount of measurements N2 that was there, this was not a major source of contribution, even though it would be a major source of heat if significant amount was allowed to happen. Anaerobic processes, we used a very simple model that was developed by a lot of people in the landfill industry called LandGem. It is a way to simply calculate methane production from degradation of specific compounds, knowing their rate and the amount that's there. We included things like cellulose, hemicellulose, and starch. We knew the literature values for their amount of heat that could be generated from that reaction, and using a combination of LandGem and the amount that was present of this, we can extrapolate how much heat is being contributed from this. We did not model this from a fundamental mechanistic with all the reaction or potential pathways that you would get in an anaerobic process. We wanted to be a little bit more simpler and just use something like this to capture the essence of that. Again, since biological activity was shut down, we needed to come up with an equation that tries to capture when that biological activity was at its highest. And so this was a way of trying to put a curve that says within this band that methane production or that methane from LandGem would still be active. We since revised this from experiments, but I'm just showing you the results, still had this in there, but we had done a little bit more work to come up with what that range was. And I think some of it goes a little bit further this way, where you see more contributions in the 60 to 70 range and than what was being modeled with this particular sort of function, so inhibition function. And then we included ash hydration and carbonation. Most of it related to what we knew at the time was calcium bearing fraction of that. Whereas in the process now, Mort has a team that I'm a part of that are doing measurements under landfill relevant conditions with actual MSW ash as well as coal ash to really find out what are the actual heat that's being generated from that, and recognizing that not all ash is completely just lime related, that there may be other bearing oxides and hydroxides that may be contributing, maybe not to this full extent. But all the modeling results here use this literature values for heat production and rates for degradation. For metal corrosion, we included mostly the more common ones that we would have expected, which would be iron and aluminum. Notice that aluminum contributes a lot of heat, and probably, and as you will see, was the major contributor, iron being a sort of minor player in all of that. And so you'll see those results in that. Some complications that make this really challenging to really see what happens in landfill is what happens on the surfaces of some of these metal species in the form of, they could become as aluminum cans, they could be foils, they could be sheets, and then what happens on those surfaces once this process begins. And we were not able to capture those kinds of things which might inhibit continued corrosion degradation of those processes. Okay, so as far as starting with some results, looking at neutralization, aspect-based neutralization, we noticed that there wasn't a whole lot of contribution to that, and so that really wasn't a major impact. And then as well as, remember I said about nitrogen intrusion, which was representative of how much aerobic contribution, because of the amount that was present and what we expected, that also was not a major contributor in these landfills. And so they were subsequently eliminated from model further investigation. And you're not working anymore. You're slow. Okay, so where did we see much of this in terms of the batch reactor? Well, just to model what would happen under just landfill relevant conditions for MSW, our model predicts, well, yep, it should come below 50, but the major contributions was, again, ash aluminum corrosion. And then, of course, if both of them are happening simultaneously, our batch reactor models were clearly showing that this was the significant contribution to what the higher temperatures that one might see. And again, this is based on literature results, which we are now trying to get a better handle on real landfill conditions. But at the time, this was very helpful to really hone in and advise landfill owners that this is the things that you need to be worried about if you are a landfill that is accepting ash, whether it be MSW or coal ash as part of their disposal strategy. So again, just incorporating some of the things that we did in terms of what would release and the heat loss. We never got into condensation, which we will do in the next model. But the contributors that we noticed was, again, ash and either ash hydration and carbonation. And then aluminum corrosion was the main thing. Of course, we included anaerobic biodegradation as part of the typical biological processes that are being used. We no longer included ion corrosion as part of that. And again, acid-base neutralization was no longer part of our investigation. So what are the advantages? Well, the model that we did here was really fast. I mean, this is a batch reactor. We can run these simulations, very simple to code. We are actually in the process of trying to find something that is in between a very simple batch reactor model versus a full-blown finite element model. And so we're creating this sort of like compartmentalized batch reactor model, which is a cheap version of a finite element model to try to put something in between and actually put it in the hands of the landfill owners that it could be run from hopefully a cellular device or some very laptop where they can run some of these very simulations that is informative, but not as expensive and or challenging and having knowledge of finite element modeling. Okay. All right. So to try to get some of the heterogeneous waste inputs, places spatially to bury this thing, where you can now look at strategies for disposal, we needed the finite element model, which does a lot more to look at how heat is transferred throughout a landfill. So we're looking at what maybe is a location where heat is being produced. It undergoes evaporation, but then there's another location where that evaporation would condense, would cause condensation, allow it to cool, but condensation also, that process also produces heat. We weren't able to include that, but now we were able to include that in our finite element model. So this is a representation of a simple version of one that we did, a very simple cuboid-like landfill. We looked at different heights just to try to look at the effect if you bury something that's only 40 meters versus 80 meters. We had to make some adjustments in terms of how the cells were loaded up. And so this is an image showing how the loading of the cells, and we included this transient time in that process from the bottom of the landfill all the way to the top. And, you know, trying to be as close to real conditions that were happening at a landfill, just to get an idea of what might happen to the heat propagation in such an environment. Just to give you some ideas of what we had as boundary conditions at the top, that boundary condition was about 20 degrees C, but below the bottom of the landfill, we tried to say not at the landfill bottom, but 5 meters in the soil, that boundary condition was 15 degrees C. The model is sensitive to boundary conditions, as you can imagine, and so some of those were looked at as part of the analysis. We would do our analysis over a 30-year period, and the runtime for such a model like this with the millions of cells that we use, these smaller things are actually the gas wells that we tried to incorporate in each of those, so we looked at that portion of it. It took about 3 to 4 days to simulate a 30-year period. So just some quick results here. This is a landfill where there's only MSW, and you can see the eventual heating up of this landfill to reach temperatures that are typical of landfill type conditions. You can see the effect of the top boundary condition on these results, but the profile was surprisingly close to what you would expect, that you would see this kind of higher temperature profile with a peak somewhere around 50 degrees C, somewhere below the landfill top that reached that maximum temperature that you would get with that. And then, of course, these things would heat up as materials is biodegrading and things are going away. They would start to eventually cool down with time. These are some images of the profile and temperature over at two different periods, 6 and 30 year, for two different depths, because we wanted to show that depth does matter, and that you will see some change in the temperature profile, nothing exceeding when you're talking about normal temperatures of a functioning landfill. And this is just showing that the volume fraction of the material as it's being consumed, that the temperature would start to, or that volume fraction will go down, which allow for that temperature to start to go down with time. Now, again, with a model like this, the benefits, it now allows the user to explore strategies for landfill burial of the ash. So this is one form of block dumping, so to speak, where you say that a specific region of the cells are pure ash, and only ash are in that section. And so this is where we simulated the central location of this landfill is where ash is buried. As you can see, you get very high temperatures according to the model simulation that we have, well above 100 degrees C, with the center of this ash being where that hot zone begins. And of course, with time, it starts to cool. But the beauty of this is that it shows how that temperature dissipates through its surroundings, knowing the heat capacity of some of that material in its surroundings, and that conduction moves that temperature to other portions of that landfill. Now, here is another image to say, well, what if we wanted to do a block fill that's not central, but now on the edge of the landfill as a different strategy? Again, you'll see that heating that happens with time, but you get higher temperatures and less dissipation because, again, this is bounded by the region of that landfill, and so conduction only has one way to go through this through this landfill, as opposed to being centrally buried. And so you will see higher temperatures if you were to do a block fill on the edge, because of the ability to the heat loss not to propagate as efficiently as if it was in that center location. Looking at side profiles, again, when you have these burials for ash, except this now, instead of block filling, let's look at the strategy of spreading the ash and putting 10% or 20% ash in MSW and spreading that everywhere. And so you can see the temperatures are lower compared to the block fill, that you don't get the extremes. But then this is deceiving, as you will find out, because if you spread the ash to allow the heat to be spread more uniformly, trying to minimize extreme hot temperatures in specific zones, but what does that then do to biological activity, which is very sensitive? And so are you now putting more regions at risk to having less biological activity because you've now spread the ash in other locations? And that's what exactly happens. So what this shows is the cumulative normalized landfill volume and regions where the temperature exceeds 65 degrees C, and regions or fractions of that landfill that exceeds 80 degrees C. And what you will see is that when you look at ash in the center, places, a fraction of the landfill that is exceeding 65 degrees C, and for this is block fill, is 11%, while if it is exceeding 80 degrees C, it's about 8%. That's if you measure, put it in the center. If you put it in the corner, there is benefits to that because there is less of the landfill that are exceeding that higher threshold of 65 degrees C, 80 degrees C. But now look at when you start using spreading the ash everywhere. 49% of that ash is now, or that landfill is now exceeding 65 degrees C. We didn't see anything. If you're doing 10%, you don't see any place where we saw exceeding 80 degrees C. But 20% ash, 81% of the landfill exceeded 65 degrees C, and 64% of that same landfill exceeded 80 degrees C, which means if your strategy is to try to make your landfill still highly biologically active, spreading that ash would do your landfill a disservice if you're trying to still maintain some of that. So it sort of provided some thought to the landfill owner that maybe we should be strategizing. Either you might say, oh, maybe before I bury the ash, I will do something to hydrate it, maybe let natural environment, let the heat gets released before you bury it. Maybe even get some carbonation processes happening, even though more of that will happen within the landfill. So you can reduce some of it by different strategies, but then maybe consider putting it in a block fill to finish it out so that you can benefit from most of your landfill still functioning in its intended purpose. So batch reactor model, so I'm coming to my end here. It was very effective in telling us what portions of the processes were generating that heat, which led to incorporating it into a 3D model to really look at the effects of burial strategies that one could use to look at, to keep that landfill functioning. Ash hydration and carbonation and metal corrosion were the most significant to increasing that temperature, and that's something that we continue to do. It produced many of the shapes. I didn't show the experimental measurements. We're in the process right now and finishing work that has validated our model with an existing landfill that has gas temperatures as well as fiber optic probe temperatures at different locations, some away from an ash site and some where it was close to the ash site. And surprisingly, the model was not bad. So I don't take all the credit for that. It maybe is that we've incorporated many of the features. It's not perfect, but we were able to show the very shape that we see experimentally in full-scale landfills when we have done that. I didn't talk about this a lot, but deeper landfills, there are more heat that will accumulate because, again, you got a heat capacity. We're trying to remove that heat. The heat loss is a little bit more challenging when you have deeper landfills, right? And again, finally, just to reiterate about block fills may be the best way to at least reduce a lot of the effects of high temperature on biological activity. And as I'm mentioning, there may be some effort in doing a pre-hydration before you put it in the landfill, put it off to the side, allow it to hydrate, release that heat, and then bury it. There may be some remaining carbonation that will happen, but the effect of that will be low. With that, that's the story I have to say, and I'm sticking with it.
One of the things that people have been talking about for a while, and I think it's fallen a little bit out of favor, but was this idea of recirculating the leachate within a landfill in order to stimulate biodegradation. And I wonder if you can comment on what effect you think that would have, and then could you model that, because you would be continuing to move that leachate, and so presumably moving some of that heat out. And would that be a way of, it wouldn't be a pre-hydration outside the landfill, but maybe you could do some rapid corrosion, post-hydration, I guess, but with this
right. So that I will never say we can't model it. Oh, okay. Can we recirculate leachate as a strategy for, I guess, accelerating or minimizing some of that heat production or controlling the heat production, things like that? I'll never say that I can't. What I've learned over the 20-something years of doing this is I can model just about anything. I just can't tell you if it's right. But in the case of something like that, it would be interesting. We would have to know the leachate properties, if this is post-treatment or the raw leachate that has just come out and now you're recirculating. It probably will have an effect on corrosion quite a bit. So that may change some of that aspects of corrosion. I don't know about that. As far as ash hydration and portion of it, I think if somehow it could diffuse, one of the things that it's not clear to me is how well does liquid actually infuses in a block fill. That's not certain how well it diffuses. That's a part that we didn't model very carefully. We just said we assume that this infiltration is just wetting the entire block fill uniformly. We may add some diffusion, convection properties to slow things down, depending on compared to landfill surrounding. There would be some difference in that transport, but I'm still not quite certain that the center of a block fill really sees complete, hydration or even carbonation if the gases that are forming, they infiltrate into that. So I'm not sure. So it would be interesting to try. If there are landfills that do recirculate as part of the strategy, it would definitely be interesting to try to see how that might change this picture. The other part would be how it is recirculated. I guess if it's through pipes where it's got perforated holes, we would try to have to capture that, and it's always challenging when you got, as you can tell, that huge landfill and those little gas wells. So you can imagine how well do we capture the flow distribution around that little tiny thing. We would have to approximate it so we wouldn't have to worry about putting a gazillion cells to capture it properly. So it's a possible strategy, and that's the beauty of these models, is to be able to do these what if scenarios. So I didn't answer your question, but it would be interesting to observe and see what the impact is. I gotta believe it would have an impact on corrosion, and I would suspect if you put the wetting directly in the block fill, that may do some different things and maybe speed up that process as opposed to taking 10 years. It may take shorter, because you are doing something to effectively hydrate that section. So the question was that much of the temperatures that we saw would affect the liner around it. And that's absolutely a concern. That's the reason why those, even though we wanted to show block fills in a corner, but if there is a liner right there, that's a no starter. And so it is important. I think from this, they noticed that if there were going to be anything that would be near a liner, that this would be a strategy that would not work. We didn't model the liner itself, obviously. This is just a representation of where that temperature would get to, temperatures that might affect the infrastructure. And the liner question did come up. And so Mort had said that we have to be careful about the messaging on this. He was very clear. He had years of experience of dealing with landfill owners and knowing what the challenges are. Even though we proposed, let's look at all of this, because I'm just like, hey, we can do whatever. I don't know enough. But he had called into question and knew that this would be an impact on the line state. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, so it's like in the balance.
Yeah.
Like protecting biological activity, but obviously.
The infrastructure is part of the equation, and particularly liners. Thank you for sharing that, because that is another advantage of putting it in the center. But then you got to worry about the bottom as well. You can't put it all the way at the bottom, as the image seems to suggest. Yeah, so the question is putting some kind of technology to better dissipate the heat from particularly these hot regions. So I know I'm being recorded, but my understanding is that landfill owners are very protective of cost. And so while certain technologies might be better to do this, they would prefer, if they really wanted to reduce the heat, and it's a concern, they're probably going to put it off to the side before they bury it to begin with, and say that's more effective for them, is just piled the ash over here. Here's my landfill. Let it hydrate, get that heat off of there. You'll see the steam, whatever. But it's not affecting my landfill yet. And then once there's some time that has allowed for this to, now bury it in an appropriate way that limits that. I'm assuming the gas wells serve that purpose, because again, that's a way to release the heat that's there. So that's probably the way they would prefer to do it, because they already put those gas wells in there. They just want to make sure that content of that gas well is still more methane driven versus some of the other gases that would be there. And you saw from those images, landfill construction, I didn't know until I got into this. It's more of a geotechnical problem than anything else. And the geotechnical engineers really want to preserve an infrastructure that allows for the shape and design of these landfill and make that. They don't like to see this, rapid settlement and all kinds of things that are happening with heat. So, from a design standpoint, I get what you're saying. I think it's satisfied mostly by the gas wells who are doing some of the things that you're doing. But the infrastructure is very critical for them to make sure it doesn't change. So,
sounds like there are landfills out here that have this problem, and so if the liner could be compromised, it could eventually get into the groundwater. So, what is the retrofit then without? Is that to drill these gas wells in them to dissipate the heat, or what?
Well, the strategy is, they're not going to bury that thing if it's going to, do harm to their liner, because that has to be preserved. My understanding is, I didn't repeat the question. So the question is, say it again one more time.
So like
Retrofit.
Existing problems that are out there, what do they do to prevent the compromise, for example, of the line?
I don't know the full answer to that, to be frank. From my understanding is they would do all these other strategies that they typically do. If it was something like, say, for example, as a shallow landfill, where now there is the opportunity that they might be close to the liner, they're going to do something very different to make sure that heat gets dissipated so it never exceeds the temperature. But I think from what Mort has seen from this modeling exercise, he would not advise anything beyond 10% ash. If we were going to distribute it to try to manage it, 10% ash may be okay. And the only reason why we're saying that, remember, much of this data that I'm showing here are based on literature values for the delta H. We're currently measuring actual values for different MSW ash as well as coal ash. And they don't have these 1,500 or higher values in delta H at all. So it's actually much less than that. And that may be because, well, it's not all calcium based. There could be other kinds of oxides that don't generate as much heat. And landfills are a mixture of hodgepodge. Even ash is a mixture of hodgepodge of stuff. We made a very, idealized version of this to show its impact, but the reality is it doesn't have as much calcium content in the ashes that we have measured so far.
I've got one that's following that, Joel. So I'm thinking about how this would work in different locations. So let's say in Minnesota, I pull out most of the aluminum with the municipal solid waste, and there's a move to pull out most of the compostable materials too, because that has value above ground. Versus my in-laws used to live in a state just south of North Carolina, where everything went in the trash, right? So whether it was biodegradable or aluminum or anything, and so how different would like a landfill operation in Minnesota, where you have different materials and different temperatures, be South Carolina? Yeah.
Well, I mean, in terms of a landfill, it has different materials and different constituencies. I mean, Mort knew a lot about all these different nuances. That would have to be incorporated into the model to try to see the different burial strategies from the people who are generating most of the trash that's going there, and how that might play a role in this heat production. I would say that might change the metal corrosion type of thing, because much of this, the MSW places that burn municipal solid waste, and then accept it as putting it into ash, that's a different category, as well as those places that accept power plant emission waste, and I should say ash would be something different. We did not look into the MSW side of the house in terms of the contributions to metals and the form of metals. We are doing research to look at corrosion rates of aluminum in the forms of cans, aluminum foil, and sheets, and that data is showing some interesting values. So you'll notice the values here, I didn't really share with you, but the rate constants for those heat productions, we assumed a certain rate, some of it came from literature, some we just guessed, but the rates that we're actually seeing in our labs, way higher, almost to the point where if we were to put it in the model, we might as well say at the very beginning, the temperature just jumps to this very high value and then starts to go down based on the values that we're getting. So the question is, are there other processes that we're missing, even if these are true rate values that we're getting in the lab, even under landfill relevant conditions, because Mark was very particular about putting this under relevant conditions. So we built reactors to simulate as much of these landfill conditions. If these rates are true, then we're missing a whole nother process that allows infiltration and all other kinds of things to slow it down and spread it over a long period, because we're not seeing these kind of rapid rise and then drop. That's not happening. So either our rate values are correct, but we don't have all the mechanisms in the landfill actually modeled right to allow that heat to dissipate over a longer period of time or be generated over a long period of time. It's unknown. So that's the part that I'm not sure of. So the question was about using some of this cogen or heating process itself as a strategy as well. That I don't know. I would say it hasn't come up in a conversation. I would say I would defer to my colleague Mort Barles, who might know if that is a strategy that's being used. It sounds to me they want to suppress any of these elevated temperature conditions to the point where it's not affecting the traditional activity of a landfill. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate you all.